This episode is actually going to be life-changing because I'm going to cover emotions and addiction. Let's get into it. We should be careful about the mismanagement of emotion. Emotional intelligence is the capacity to recognize, understand, regulate, and respond wisely to emotions, both our own and other people's, because many disasters begin long before the visible disaster. They begin with things like pride. I cannot admit that I was wrong. Feeling like we must act now. Things like anger, envy, and insecurity. Thinking that I need relief now. Consequences can come later, and more. And these emotions can become decisions, which decisions can produce enormous consequences. Emotional intelligence isn't merely about being nice or emotionally expressive. At its deepest level, it's a form of self-governance where, for example, you feel anger, but don't automatically obey it. You experience humiliation, but you don't organize your life around revenge. You become successful, but you don't become entitled. A mature moral life requires us to examine not only what we are doing, but the emotional state in which we are doing it. What is driving you? Emotional maturity is not the absence of powerful emotions, but the ability to prevent powerful actions from just coming and becoming powerful masters. Many personal catastrophes don't begin with one enormous mistake. They begin with an emotion that we have refused to understand, followed by a small decision under its influence. Emotionally intelligent people don't necessarily feel less than everyone else. They've learned a number of things about emotions that many of us intuitively misunderstand. They know that feeling is not a fact. They know that emotions have causes. Instead of simply asking, why am I angry? They might ask, what expectation was violated? Anger might contain hurt, jealousy might contain insecurity, anxiety might contain uncertainty. So they investigate the emotion rather than immediately obeying it, and they know that intensity does not equal importance. That a feeling may be extremely strong and still be misleading. Because your brain can scream that this matters when something actually matters very little. So emotional intelligence creates a small space between feeling, interpretation, and action. So emotionally intelligent people know that other people are experiencing an entirely different reality that we cannot see. What might be happening inside them that I don't know? Ask yourself that. They know that people defend their self-image, and when someone is criticized, they may not be defending the truth. They may be defending their identity. But emotionally intelligent people learn that they can be wrong without becoming worthless, which makes learning much easier. They know that boundaries are different from punishment. They know that self-control isn't emotional suppression, and they can be angry without becoming cruel. They can be afraid without becoming cowardly. They can be ambitious without becoming obsessed. And they can be hurt without needing to hurt someone else. They don't avoid it. It isn't, I shouldn't feel this, but I feel this. What should I do with it? They know that attention is a form of power, and whatever you repeatedly attend to becomes psychologically larger. They know that you don't have to act on every emotion. You can think, I want to quit without necessarily quitting. You can feel anger and envy and desire and shame or disappointment and simply let the emotion be present while you decide what kind of person you want to be. And that's emotional intelligence at its deepest. You don't become less human when you do that. You become less controlled by whatever happens to be moving on through you. Because the opposite of emotional intelligence is mostly emotional indulgence or even avoidance. We often imagine that dealing with an emotion means getting rid of it. I'm anxious. How do I stop being anxious? Or I'm sad. How do I cheer myself up? But sometimes the wiser question is, can I allow myself to fully experience what is already here? Because why do I avoid these emotions? Because emotions can be uncomfortable. So we develop strategies to reduce anxiety, to distract ourselves, to entertain ourselves out of our sadness. When we feel shame, we rush to defensiveness. In order to avoid loneliness, we rush to compulsive socializing. In order to avoid fear, we procrastinate. The problem is that avoidance can teach the brain that this feeling is dangerous and so I must escape it. And then the emotion becomes doubly difficult. First, you experience the original feeling and then you become frightened of experiencing the feeling. That's how we can become anxious about being anxious. Feelings about feelings. Feelings aren't the same as acting. We need to make that distinction that you can feel anger without attacking someone and you can feel jealous without trying to control someone. Emotion is an experience, but action is a choice. Emotional maturity is mostly learning to keep those two things separate. And when you stop fighting an emotion, you often change the trajectory. You experience it, you remain present, and eventually it changes. Not necessarily because you forced it to change, but because emotions are dynamic experiences rather than permanent states. And this is why sometimes you can be sitting with sadness and suddenly you notice that, oh, I'm still sad, but I'm not fighting the sadness anymore. That itself can feel like relief. So the goal isn't necessarily to make sadness disappear, but to stop adding a second layer of suffering. The one of avoidance. That I shouldn't feel this. And then there is rumination. Why did they do this? What does it say about me? What if this always happens? I should have said it. They probably think this. The first brings you into the presence of the experience. So you need to feel the emotion. Don't build a prison around it. There is also something deeply human about a life without painful emotions. It isn't actually the goal. If you want to eliminate grief, you will also diminish attachment. You would have to stop caring about outcomes. If you want to eliminate vulnerability, you have to protect yourself from meaningful connection as well. The mature goal, therefore, isn't emotional invulnerability, but emotional capacity. To become someone who can say, I can experience this without being destroyed by it. And perhaps that's the deepest form of emotional resilience if you think about it. It's not needing life to stop producing difficult emotions because you have become increasingly capable of meeting whatever emotion arrives. Avoidance of uncomfortable internal states is one of the major mechanisms behind many addictions. Let's talk about addiction now. Addiction usually happens when something feels difficult. We discover something that reliably changes how we feel, and then we repeatedly use it to escape or alter that feeling. Then the brain learns the association, and eventually the behavior becomes compelling even when we don't consciously want it. The uncomfortable state doesn't even have to be like an obvious state of sadness. It can be boredom, loneliness, shame, frustration, uncertainty, or just feeling stuck. And of course, the person isn't consciously thinking, I am escaping an emotion. No, they simply experience an urge. For example, suppose you're anxious and you immediately reach for entertainment, right? There are actually two things happening. Emotion, I feel anxious. And then the response, I need to make this feeling stop. The second can become an addictive pattern because relief is very powerful. It's a powerful reinforcer. And that's why addiction isn't necessarily about pursuing pleasure. Sometimes it is much more about escaping discomfort. And this explains why simply removing the addictive behavior it's not that easy. Imagine someone takes away the behavior but doesn't develop another way of relating to the discomfort, right? The underlying experience remains boredom equals discomfort, or loneliness equals discomfort, or anxiety equals discomfort. And the mind searches for another escape in that scenario. This is one reason people can substitute one compulsive behavior for another. The specific behavior changes, but the underlying relationship with the discomfort hasn't necessarily changed. So instead of discomfort, then escape, you can gradually learn discomfort, then awareness, then allowing, then there you have choice. So you notice I am restless, but you don't immediately try to fix it. You notice the urge, you allow the uncomfortable sensation to exist. You don't have to make it disappear, and then you choose what to do. That is a very different relationship with your own mind. You're essentially teaching yourself that I can experience an unpleasant internal state without immediately needing to change it. See, that's the problem. Thinking that we immediately need to change it. So that needs enormous psychological capacity. The aim isn't to become someone who never feels uncomfortable, but to become someone who doesn't need to flee from discomfort every single time it occurs. Now, of course, addiction isn't, no, it's more complicated than emotional avoidance alone. Biology, environment, trauma, mental health, and the context and the properties of a substance, all these matter. So we shouldn't introduce addiction to, you just need to feel your feelings. But as a general psychological principle, it is extremely powerful. The less capable we are of being with ourselves when we feel uncomfortable, the more tempting anything that can temporarily take us away from ourselves becomes. You really have to learn that an urge can be experienced without being obeyed. But you shouldn't expect yourself to do that through willpower alone. Stop making the goal never to feel the urge. An urge is not a command. At first, that can feel almost unbearable. But if you repeatedly experience the urge without automatically responding, you begin to learn that your addiction has obscured. That this feeling rises, it changes, and eventually it passes. Hence, you don't need to defeat the urge, you need to outlast it. Think about that, you need to outlast it. And you need to learn to tolerate the emotion underneath. Because often the behavior isn't the real problem. So for example, in the case of loneliness, you don't immediately solve the loneliness, but you allow yourself to experience some loneliness, right? That is the training. And also, make the addictive behavior harder to access. Don't turn recovery into a heroic contest between your willpower and the environment in which you are, right? Change the environment, put distance between yourself and the behavior. Spend more time around people when isolation is a trigger. You're not being weak when you do that, you're being strategic. And if you remove an addiction and replace it with nothing, your brain also asks, okay, what do I do now? So you need things that can provide healthier forms of stimulation. Maybe achievement, or connection, or rest, or novelty, and enjoyment. Build a life that makes escape less necessary. If your ordinary life is chronically characterized by things like isolation, boredom, stress, a lack of purpose, sleep, maybe constant stimulation, then addictive behavior has fertile ground. Consider meaningful work, friendships, physical activity, learning, creative projects, time outside, good sleep, real conversations, and things that you are genuinely interested in. None of these magically cure addiction, but they change your psychological ecosystem. Then expect setbacks as well without turning them into complete surrender. When you sleep, which you're likely to, or fail to get disciplined once, don't think, I've ruined everything. A setback is not a verdict. Ask what happened immediately beforehand, what was I feeling, and where was I? What can I change next time? Don't hate the part of yourself that became addicted. Instead, it's more something like, something in me learned this behavior because it provided relief, right? Now I need to teach myself another way of dealing with that pain. That this behavior is harming me and I am responsible for changing it. Feel the restlessness or the boredom or the loneliness or the anxiety. Feel the craving, and you don't have to like it. You don't even have to understand it. You just don't need to automatically escape. And over time, you're building something more valuable than resistance to one particular addiction, which is the ability to remain present with yourself, even when it's a bit uncomfortable. And that ability can change far more than the addiction itself. So subscribe to Growthplace and check out the premium. Link is in the description below for more content like this. Until next time.